Afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know a few other people will slide in the next few minutes, which is fine. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director for the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Some of you may perhaps be here for the first time, and so I will offer just a very brief word about the Wilson Center. We're chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We serve as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue in order to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. All of this is done in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson, who, as you all know, I'm sure, is the only U.S. president to have held a PhD. The Asia program, the Wilson Center's Asia program, which is hosting this event in partnership with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security program, provides a forum here in Washington for enhancing deeper understanding of and policy debate about Asia. So our subject today, as you all know, is the Rohingya. The Rohingya community is easily one of the most vulnerable and marginalized in the world today. It suffers extensive persecution in the various areas of the world where it is based. The various hardships that it experiences have entailed many mass migrations and displacements. One of the most recent tragedies experienced by this community was in August 2017 when security forces in Rakhine state in Burma cracked down heavily on the Rohingya. Thousands are estimated to have died. Hundreds of thousands are estimated to have migrated next door to Bangladesh, which was a country that was already home to several thousand Rohingya before that. The authorities in Bangladesh provided them with shelter and other services, though the conditions have not been very good. These refugees in Bangladesh are now in limbo, not really sure of their fate, not sure if and when they'll be sent back to Burma or if they'll be sent someplace else. Back in Burma, the plight of the Rohingya continues to be precarious, to say the least. So our discussion today will look at what is going on with the Rohingya community today and what could be in store for the future. The issue has really faded from the headlines, but the plight of the Rohingya really remains as significant as it does uncertain. And we are very fortunate today to have with us one of the foremost experts on Burma and also the Rohingya. This is, of course, Dr. Nehginpao Kipgen. He is an associate professor as well as assistant dean for international collaboration and executive director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the Jindal School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University in India. His research interests include democratization, human rights, ethnic conflict, identity politics, and his academic research focuses on South and Southeast Asia with a specialization in Burma. You have his bio in front of you so you could read about it in more detail. We also have with us one of our own, so to speak, one of the current Wilson Center Fellows, Michael Davis, who is here in residence over the present academic year working on a project looking at democracy and governance in Asia. He is a professor of law and international affairs at Jindal Global University and a senior fellow at the Liu Institute for Asian Studies at Notre Dame University. He'll be a discussant this afternoon. So in just a moment, we'll have Dr. Kipgen speak on the issue of the Rohingya. He'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have Michael offer some comments before we go to a discussion. We should have plenty of time for a Q&A. So with that, I cede the floor to Dr. Kipgen.
Good afternoon, everyone. For the past few weeks, I've been suffering from this sore throat, so my voice is not good enough, but I'll try to make it clear as much as possible. Thank you so much for coming, and also I would like to say thank you to Michael, both Michaels on my left and my right, for giving me this platform to talk about what's really one of the, I would say, one of the most sensitive and one of the most hot issues, at least in recent times, especially what's happening since the past 2-3 years ago. And today, as Michael just made a brief introduction, I'll be looking at different proposals or different propositions from different countries. I'll look at what is proposed by Myanmar or Burma, and also I will study a little bit about what Bangladesh is planning, and also I will look at what is China's plan in trying to resolve this crisis, and also look at briefly talk about what's happening recently and what might happen in the future. So that's it will take about 15 to 20 minutes. And of course, we will have plenty of time, as Michael said, to have interaction and also answer your questions if you may have. Now, let me first begin with what is proposed by Bangladesh. So I don't want to start off with the history because I think most of us may have some idea, but in case you would like to know about the history and what happened, how it started, we can also probably talk about those during the Q&A. But now, in most recent time, let's say in the past 2 months or so, I mean a month ago or so, in February, Bangladesh Foreign Minister proposed what it called a safe zone inside Myanmar, in order to resolve this Rohingya crisis. So he talked about establishing a safe zone inside Burma under the vigilance of Russia, India, China, and members of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And so that's one of the proposals in recent times, what Bangladesh is making. Not only that, there is another proposal or another plan in order to ease or in order to somehow mitigate the problem or the overcrowded population in the Cox's Bazar. So there is another plan with what they call floating island. A lot of people, some of you might have heard in the news, in what they call Basanchar, but which is literally translated as floating island. So what it means is that there are about, let's say, about 1 million or so population or refugee population are crammed in these Cox's Bazar refugee camps. In order to, let's say, provide more space for these people, the Bangladesh government would like to relocate about 100,000 or so of them to the Basanchar, or let's say the floating island. So they have constructed over 1,000, let's say, places or temporary houses to accommodate them. The problem is whether the refugee community or population would be willing to go. As far as my research and my interaction with people or scholars or the refugee community is concerned, there are at least about three opinions about this. So it was proposed in February, and the idea is to start relocating this refugee population to the floating island starting this month, April. But the problem is, until so far, there is no concrete or there is no visible movement of people over there. So there are a few problems. Number one, what Bangladesh is trying to do is that what they said to the international community is that we will only do if the refugee community are willing to go to the floating island. And based on some interviews and based on these news outlets, Rohingya community mostly don't want to go there. So one of the reasons being that the area or the island has never been inhabited by human beings. And it's prone to these floods and these natural calamities. Therefore, they don't want to go there. They want to spend where no life has been ever settled. So the problem here is, but there are some people within the Rohingya community, instead of going back to Burma and go to the same experience, they would rather choose to go to the floating island. But until now, we do not see any physical movement or any transfer of population from the Cox's Bazar to the floating island. So this is connected, but the first one, the safe zone thing, which I personally do not believe that this is feasible for different reasons. The first being that Myanmar would not allow that to happen. They would say, or they would think that that's interference in the internal matters, or let's say as a threat to national sovereignty and security. Therefore, it is unlikely that Burma or Myanmar would allow the international community, Russia, China, India, and members of ASEAN provide safe zone for the Rohingya community. So that's pretty much about what Bangladesh is proposing at the moment. Of course, their ultimate goal is the safe return of all refugees back to Burma, which is at the moment unlikely to happen in the near future. And now I would like to talk about what Myanmar or Burma is proposing. Of course, Burma is not people who follow closely what's happening in Burma, you would know that Burma is not a country fully transitioned into democracy yet. What we call in social science hybrid democracy, where there is elements of both democracy and authoritarian regime. As you may know, the military is still very powerful in the country. Therefore, the civilian government has no absolute control or power over the military yet. So here, at least the plan of this NLD government is that after the bilateral agreement was reached between Myanmar or Burma and Bangladesh, they would take back this refugee into Burma and settle them back. But and also once they come back, they would verify. They would provide verification documents or verification card to each returnees, and eventually that would provide or that would lead to a path for citizenship. So that's what the Burmese government, at least the civilian government, is proposing. But I would like to clarify a few things here. What happens in Burma is not. It's something very different from many countries around the world, because the government that we see is elected by the people are not absolutely in control of the government. It's what they say they are in control of. Therefore, for example, the military is still not open to that idea. They say, well, for example, if I may quote the word of this the commander-in-chief, the military chief in command, Min Aung Hlaing, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, what he said was, until and unless the genuine citizens of Burma, which he referred to the Arakans or Rakhine, these people would not be accepted back into Burma, which means the Rohingya population. So there is still a division, or let's say a differences between the military and the civilian government. In the meantime, it is also not good to remember that the Rakhine population or the Arakan population, many of them largely they are not opening and they are not welcoming such proposal from the government. They said they maintain a position that these people are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, therefore they should not come back. So this is something, there are three parties or three stakeholders, the civilian government, the military, and the local Arakan or Rakhine population. So, and what happens is that the Rohingya community themselves, they are making a few lists of demands before they can go back to Burma. Number one is that they would like to go back to the place where they belong. They would like to see all their, lands being returned to them, and their worship places being rebuilt. And also, they would like the government to officially guarantee that they be recognized as Rohingyas as one of the ethnic groups of the country. For your information, there are 135 national or ethnic races in Myanmar or Burma, and Rohingya is not there. And the demand, one major demand of the population is that they would like to be recognized as a Rohingya and as one of the ethnic groups. And the more important one is citizenship. Not just being recognized, but they would also like to be granted citizenship, which I fairly discussed this in my latest journal article published by Routledge from London a couple of weeks ago. So there is a complete contrast between what the refugee committee wants to see and what the military or the civilian population, or let's say the Arakan population, want to see. So, but at the moment, what we see is that the Burmese government does not make any commitment to provide security to Rohingya population, or to give them citizenship once they return. Of course, they say they would give a part for citizenship. That doesn't mean that there would be any guarantee for all the returnees. So this is something, what is that? Divisions, or let's say different opinions within from different parties within Burma. And now I would like to come to the Chinese plan, which is a little bit old, but in fact this started in 2017. And for China, the problem is poverty. They do not talk about citizenship or let's say identity. For China, the main problem in Rakhine, or let's say the Rohingya crisis, is about poverty, which means that, of course, they have they proposed 3-stage plan. The first one being that to bring ceasefire, or to maintain ceasefire, to restore peace, law and order in Rakhine, so that no Rohingya members flee the country anymore. That's the first stage. And the second stage being that the international community and the UN Security Council must or should help Bangladesh and Burma to find amicable bilateral solution for Rohingya problem. And of course, the third one is that they would like the international community should help to elevate poverty problem in Rakhine or in Arakan, so that the root cause of, according to them, the root cause of the crisis can be addressed. So far what we see is that the first one being, of course, more or less achieved, because not absolutely, but largely it's achieved, which means there is no large number of people fleeing the country anymore, and by and large the security situation in the state, Arakan state, is peaceful. I'm not saying that absolutely, but it's largely peaceful now. But the second stage and the third stage is still a problem, because of course, because of pressure and let's say criticism from international community, Burma and Bangladesh reached an agreement in let's say late 2017 and also in 2018 again, to take back under 1992 peace agreement, which means the Rohingya community must provide a document, or let's say a proof that they belong to Burma before Burma can process their return. Of course, there are several issues or several problems, challenges to this as well. For example, many of this Rohingya community never had such document in the first place. And number two, many people who had those documents, many of them, their villages were burned down. And it was possible that those documents were burned down. Or since many of them fled in a rush, in a hurry, it might have been possible that many of them have lost their documents. So, it is very good, but it is unrealistic. And the third one, of course, the international community has been helping and trying to promote peace, or let's say develop Arakan area, but unfortunately, this is not, we don't see much improvement as of now. And of course, there is another recent thing happening, is the fight between Arakan army and the Burmese military forces. This is impeding, or creating another problem. And that's why the attention is now between the fight between Arakan army and the military forces. So I have just talked about 3 proposals from 3 different countries, 3 main stakeholders, let's say: China, Burma, and Bangladesh. And now what happened next? That's the topic of our discussion today. What's next for the Rohingya? So what we would like to see happening is that these people go back to Burma and stay there peacefully, or let's say live a life with human dignity. But unfortunately, there are 2 possible outcomes in the near future. Number one is that under international pressure, or let's say with the international support, let's say ASEAN members, especially ASEAN members, Burma would be willing to, let's say, expedite the process and try to address this crisis, and maybe even if they cannot take all of them, they may start taking back this population. And even if they cannot guarantee citizenship right away, they may try to assure the population that they would all get equal chance for verification and get somehow this issue addressed. That's one possibility which can happen. But the more likely to happen is the Rohingya community would stay back in Bangladesh for the next foreseeable future. Either they move to the floating island we talked about earlier, or they stay where they are in the refugee camps in the Cox's Bazar. And of course, there are some possible consequences, outcome that could happen. Radicalization can happen. Let's say, for example, Michael was talking about now that the situation or the international attention has died down. Definitely, it's not like it used to be a year or two ago. Let's say after the attention of the international community died down, or let's say after the financial incentive or support from the international community is stopped, what would be the future? ARSA, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, may take their chance to let's say, recruit more cadres, or even ISIS and others. They are openly saying that they would support the Rohingya community. So there are possibility that these people, this community may be radicalized. I'm not saying all of them, but at least some. And that could, if that happens, unfortunately, that's going to disturb the entire Southeast Asia region. Not just Southeast Asia, but the entire Asia Pacific possibly, including South Asia and entire Southeast Asia. So, since Bangladesh has said that they would not do anything against the will of the refugee population, so sending them to the floating island is also very unlikely. I just read this morning news that this may never happen. And again, I talk about the possibility of going back to Burma. Even though this is a possibility, it may not happen in the near future. I'm talking about the possibility in the future, but not in the near future. Unfortunately, the most likely to happen is the status quo. Them remaining in Bangladesh. Of course, Bangladesh government doesn't like that. But I think, because if the international community, including United Nations, has been saying that it's not a time to send them back, and the Rohingya community are making a list of demands, they will not go back to Burma until and unless these demands are met, which I already discussed earlier. Of course, some of them also would like to be resettled in a third country, definitely. And unfortunately, so far, we do not see any country coming forward to take the Rohingya community in large numbers. Finally, I would like to say that some people try to portray the conflict as a conflict between Muslim and Buddhists, which is absolutely wrong. So there are many Muslims in the country. In fact, I went to Burma for a conference in February. There were Muslim community members came and gave a lecture. And they said, we all are not Rohingyas. And there are many Muslims who assume Burmese names and they are citizens. Even some Rohingyas who assume Burmese names are also Burmese citizens. So it's not like that it's a crisis or let's say a conflict between religions. But some people say it so because the Arakans or the Rakhines are largely Buddhist, and Rohingyas are largely or predominantly Muslim. Therefore, they try to portray it as a conflict between two religions. In fact, within Rohingya community, there are Christians, there are Hindus as well. So, of course, I can talk about the Rohingya situation in India because I come from India. There are, let me spend about a couple of minutes, Micah. There are about 40,000 Rohingya population, Rohingya refugees in different parts of India. And for India, they are a threat to national security. That's what they say. At least the BJP government says that they have some evidence that they are a threat to India's national security. But it is not publicly testified or publicly available, the data or source that we can quote. It's something that they argue, the government make an argument that they are a threat to national security. Therefore, the plan is that to find them out where they are, then deport them. In fact, they have deported 2 batches. Back in October 2018 and in January this year, they have deported 2 batches. Of course, there was a strong reservation expressed by the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. But this is what is happening. And many of them are now very skeptical about the Indian government policy. Therefore, they are trying to flee to the other side of the border in Bangladesh. Of course, about 1,300 have crossed into Bangladesh. There are many who were detained along the border areas, Indo-Bangladesh border. So the situation in India is not good, especially for this Rohingya community. And when I go back on April 27, my Center for Southeast Asian Studies is going to organize a special panel discussion on this very issue, refugee problems in India, or Burmese refugees in India. So at the moment, I think, even though there may be some things that we don't like what Bangladesh is doing, for example, trying to send people to floating island, I think we can at least acknowledge the generosity which is shown by Bangladesh government, accepting about 1 million or so Rohingya population, despite their own, let's say, large population. So with saying that, I would like to end my remarks. Of course, I will be able to, happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Dr. Kipgen for those comments. Set the stage for what should be a very interesting discussion. But first, let's give Michael Davis an opportunity to weigh in.
Thank you, Michael, and Nehginpao. I'm not an expert on Myanmar. I dabble in it a bit in the work I do on democracy, and I think a number of things that also sort of stick in my mind when I look at the situation is the surroundings. One is that this is a country where the military dominates and it's a sort of pseudo-democracy. Well, that's sort of the flavor of the month in Southeast Asia right now. Thailand is such a country. Philippines to some extent. There's some history of that in Indonesia. So the military sort of intruding upon democracy. Of course, we know Sri Lanka has tensions like this and across the region pretty much. So I think one of the things that makes this, at least, and I think Nehginpao Kipgen could verify this, things that makes it difficult is the neighborhood, that the countries surrounding Myanmar aren't likely to be a lot of help. Now, I wonder, and this is a question I have, if we look at China and India, often India sort of adheres to some principles of non-intervention that are very popular in the region. But when China steps into the mess, then sometimes that motivates India. And I don't know whether China's presence trying to propose solutions in this case may turn out to make India more forthcoming. One of the things as someone who studies democracy in the region is that India is like the tutor for much of South Asia on how to develop democracies. They often follow Indian institutions and so on. So there's this debate in India whether India should be more forthcoming in responding to the presence of China, one, which is a security side to it, and then also in looking at the problems of its neighbors, whether India's more engagement, shall we say, would be a good thing. When we look at Myanmar itself, one of the big things that comes up and comes to my mind also is Aung San Suu Kyi's rather uncomfortable problem here. She's has no power. We know that the military controls the defense, the border, home affairs, and that there's a security, national security body that the military controls. So pretty much what happened to the Rohingya and any solutions to it, she really can't call the shots. But at the same time, she's been condemned greatly for not speaking up, not finding a voice to respond to it. And I'd be interested to hear Professor Kipgen's thoughts on just, should we hold her accountable for this? Should she be chastened in some way, or is it that she's just navigating a rough political terrain that we're told that if she takes a stand on this, that this may undermine her political support in the future elections and so on. And how should she respond? I suppose the argument is that she has such an investment in trying to move the country towards democracy that, cashing it in her chips, as it were, might be politically risky. And I would like to hear more about that. Another thing that's come up is this whole question of federalism in Myanmar. I teach courses on human rights at the University of Hong Kong every year, and I always have students coming from that country, and almost always my students are of ethnic national minorities in the country. That for some reason, I'm not sure why the Burmans aren't showing up in my class. It's you yourself are not among them. So it's interesting to me that there's a big attraction for federalism among these groups. And so if you think of Rakhine State, and then you think of all these other regions that are also trying to reach a settlement with the government, is the problem for the Rohingya also entangled in this federalism issue, which I think I've seen some of your writings on it, and I know you have opinions on it. And then finally, another thing that comes to my mind, and this came up in a conference we just had at the University of Pennsylvania. We were fortunate to have the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he was talking about the connection between Xinjiang and the Rohingya problem. So China's presence here, China comes to the table with its own problem that smells and looks a lot like this problem. It's just taken a little bit different shape, but the numbers are stunningly similar. About 1 million people, we're told, are displaced through this re-education campaign in China. And I wonder to what extent that might weigh on how China participates in this and its credibility in terms of trying to deal with the problem. So I just wanted to raise a few questions because I think the audience will have much better questions than I do. But I'll let Professor Kipgen then enlighten us on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. No, I think you raised some very good questions, and I want to invite you to respond to them first before we go to the discussion. The China question is a very interesting one, particularly in the context of India, its role in trying to help address the Rohingya situation, and the broader question of Aung San Suu Kyi as well is one that I'm sure someone would have brought up if you hadn't. So please respond.
All right, let's start with the Aung San Suu Kyi question thing. Because I have been asked a lot of times this one, including the BBC from London. A few months ago, I wrote an article that Aung San Suu Kyi should not be blamed for this Rohingya crisis. And immediately, as soon as the article was published in Hindustan Times in India, one of the leading newspapers, I got a call from the BBC. They said they would like to have an interview. And of course, I said yes, and we had an interview. I would like to repeat what I said then. A few things here. Okay, before that, I would like to please clarify that I am speaking as an academic, and I have no whatsoever representing any government or any NGO here. So everything I say is purely academic and trying to be neutral and objective. And of course, every time you talk about Rohingya, it's always that even though you try to be academic, you always get into a problem because of the nature of the issue, right? All right, Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, she was under house arrest for about 14, 15 years. And she was celebrated around the world as a democratic icon, human rights champion, and working for the minorities and the downtrodden people. Definitely what she was. But things have changed. And of course, my Michael D from my right side already said that military is still absolutely powerful in the country. That's one thing. But there are a few other things. Number one, Aung San Suu Kyi is now a politician like anyone. She's a politician. So what politicians do, they would like to maintain their power, or they would like to be elected or re-elected. That's one thing, for sure. And of course, things might have been different. Let's say if she decides to give up the power and go back to what we call activism thing, the works of activists, or let's say rights advocate. But she's no longer in that situation anymore, and she is a politician, and believe it or not, even today, I do not see a lot of people from Burma, Burmese community. Of course, here, Radio Free Asia and Voice of America are here. Thank you for coming, the Burmese service. But you don't see, there are a lot of Burmese community here around Washington, D.C. area. One reason that I can tell you is that there is a perception largely in Burma, or among the Burmese population, that Rohingya are illegal immigrants. It's not just Aung San Suu Kyi. It's largely shared by the entire population. I'm not saying that all of them. It's largely. People say the same thing. The military say the same thing. The civilian government says the same thing. And a lot of electorates, a lot of citizens are also standing behind Aung San Suu Kyi and the military on this issue. For example, there were days last year when there was strong protest. For example, withdrawing some of the prizes she was awarded a long time ago. She was under international scrutiny. And at that time, what happened? If you watch television or follow the news from that part of the world, almost every now and then, there were demonstrations in support of Aung San Suu Kyi and the military on the issue of Rohingya. Of course, Michael, on my Michael can say Rohingya, and some people say Rohingya. But I asked one of the Rohingya community, and they said in their own language they call it Rohingya. But the Burmese, they say Rohingya. So, I mean, either way, it's still, I mean, it's the same. What happens? There is a strong support or a strong voice behind, or a strong opinion about this community, which means not just the military or the civilian leadership, but the population, that they are illegal immigrants. So that's why for Aung San Suu Kyi, she is an elected official now, an elected member of parliament, plus now, of course, is the state councillor. So, and the election is coming soon. And of course, she would like to be elected again. And she would like to see NLD come to power. So she has to somehow attend to the interests or look at the sentiments of the population or her electorates as a politician. And moreover, she is no longer a rights activist or democratic icon, which we cherished long time back. And of course, one time, after a lot of criticisms came, Aung San Suu Kyi was interviewed by the BBC World Service, and the interviewer asked, Aung San Suu Kyi, you have been criticized or so and so, and why don't you speak out about this Rohingya? And she said, I have spoken out, but I'm not saying what people want to hear or people want me to say. That's two different things. She is saying, she is speaking out, but it's not. She said, I would not condemn either the Arakan or the Rakhines or Rohingyas, because that would worsen the situation. So I would like to bring out, that doesn't mean that I am trying to, let's say, protect or let's say support necessarily what her voice is. Of course, there is a strong expectation as an elected leader. It is not that the military controls everything in Burma. Of course, the NDSC, the higher security apparatus or organization, plus the old departments, home affairs and border affairs are controlled by the military, but that the civilian leadership controls a larger ministries, and they have power to do things. I think Second thing, sorry if somebody get offended, but she also belongs to the Burma group. Burma forms about 69% of the population, the majority group. Burma has 135 different groups, and Aung San Suu Kyi belongs to a group called Burma or Myanmar, which is the majority group. Therefore, it is very difficult for her, as long as she would like to maintain her political dynasty or her political image, to stand against the wishes or the sentiments of the electorates. And there is also a possibility that I'm not saying that this for sure, but there is also a possibility that if she takes too strong stands on Rohingya issue and start speaking out, criticizing the military or the Arakan or Rakhines or the military, it is also possible that the military may step in. There is a possibility, but there is no certainty, but there is a possibility that the military may think that she is somehow trying to, let's say, bring disunity, or maybe this is going to affect the national security of the country. And there are some people who argue that that is a likelihood if Aung San Suu Kyi takes a too strong position on Rohingya and support Rohingya's cause. But at the same time, I would like to remind the audience, including Michael, that it is not that Aung San Suu Kyi has been silent. It was she who proposed the Kofi Annan Commission. It was her who formed, or who, let's say, allowed the formation of different internal investigation teams. Of course, it is quite clear that they are not, or every committee has come except Kofi Annan. The others were more or less its internal one. And Kofi Annan's report, two of them was that to dismantle the refugee camps, or what we call the concentration camps in Rakhine, and send back those people to their own places. And the other one was to search to find a pathway for citizenship for the Rohingya population. And except for these two, I think almost others have been somehow either it's implemented or they are trying to do it. So it's not that Aung San Suu Kyi is absolutely trying to avoid or not to address the situation, but she is doing through international support and through international cooperation. And that's why I think recently you would see that ASEAN has been a little bit more active. ASEAN, Singapore as a chair, and Thailand as a chair have spoken out on the issue, offering support. And Myanmar has been receptive, much more receptive than many years ago. But the question is, how far can they do to work together? And on the question of China factor, so when Aung San Suu Kyi NLD came to power in 2015, there was an expectation that NLD or the civilian government would now turn to the West, because it was China and some of the countries in the region which allowed the military dictatorship to survive. Burma had military rule from 62 to 2010. So it was, China has been a very staunch supporter of Burma during the military time. And it was that military who put Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest. When the NLD came to power, there was an expectation that things would change. But because of this Rohingya crisis and the issue of media, where journalists are being harassed and detained, so the Western society, including the United States, have been a little bit cautious in trying to re-establish or strengthen the ties between the two nations, or let's say with this region and Myanmar or Burma. So, and Aung San Suu Kyi, I believe, some people call it she is a pragmatic, or she is a realistic, because of the situation where she is in, where the military controls a large power. At the same time, she needs to develop or improve the economic situation of the country. Since the Western nations are not coming forward as expected, she had no choice but went back to China, make a good friend, saying, getting what we call China-Myanmar Economic Cooperation. It's coming out. And so I think China is coming in like, what is that? The same as years ago when there was sanctions versus engagement. I think it's not that China really wants to absolutely try to resolve the Rohingya crisis as such, but they would like to maintain their traditional ties and plus improve economic condition or economic relations rather than trying to resolve the Rohingya crisis.
But do you think maybe what you just described makes me think that the Rohingya situation has been way too costly for her government? That in effect, yes, she can keep the military on her side, but she loses the world. And would there be some avenue for her to have moderated that situation in a way so that the trajectory of the country, which was to get global acceptance, now they're almost under investigation in the International Criminal Court. So I think is the cost so high that she just has proven to be a failed politician, that she can get support of people who don't like Rohingya, but at the end of the day, she's do you support her judgment, or has her judgment been bad in this regard?
See, honestly, I do not necessarily support her stance on this issue, but I, at the same time, understand her situation clearly and why she is doing this. And I already gave different reasons. Number one being that she's a politician now, and she's also from the Burma majority group, and she's also having a country which is willing to help her, support her, regardless of what happens with the Rohingya crisis, or regardless of what international sanctions coming from the Western nations. I think there are a number of reasons which cannot be pinpoint just one issue, but there are a host of issues here. But that doesn't mean that I necessarily support her stance on the issue.
Okay, let me just ask you one more question before we open up, and I apologize if I'm going to invite you to speculate, but could what happened in 2017, I mean, do you think that the conditions are still there on the ground, that what happened back then could happen again? I mean, you talked about, the deep levels of discrimination, how many dismiss the Rohingya as illegal immigrants. I do know there are pockets of extremism in Burma that try to whip up anti-Muslim sentiment. We know that there are relatively few checks on the military. Could we have what played out in 2017 play out again?
Okay, Michael, I would say yes or no. Let me tell you why I say yes. Okay. The reason why I say yes is that if the issue of identity and citizenship is not addressed, even if these people go back to Burma, at some point, I think this kind of crisis may happen, may not be at the scale of what was seen in 2017, unless ARSA do something like that before again. And definitely it is possible that this kind of thing can happen. It may not be exactly at the same level of scale, but on the other side, I would say no, because the reason why, one more thing, there is always a strong, let's say, position about Rohingya community from the Arakan population. At the moment, you see a fight going on between the Arakan army and the Burmese government, military forces. Once these die down, let's say once this escalation stops, Arakan army fights for the Arakan population, Arakan people. Therefore, it is possible that this may become an issue again. So there's a possibility. May not be necessary in the near future, but there's a possibility in the future. And the reason why I say no is that there has been a strong opinion or strong pressure, strong criticism from the international community. And I do not believe that Myanmar is going to allow that to happen. Even if it may try to happen, they would do things that would somehow does not escalate the thing what we saw in 2017. Not just the Burmese government, but I think ASEAN as an organization may be more outspoken, more more becoming more, what is that, vocal on the issue, and possibly China also may somehow, even if not openly, maybe behind, they may talk to the Burmese government. And of course, the UN Security Council is stalemate, or it's powerless because of the China and Russia. I think if this kind of thing may happen again for some reason, I think the Security Council may also take a different approach than what China used to block, or China used to oppose that idea. In the future, if something may likely happen, I think those things would come into play, and I think we may not see the scale what we saw in 2017, hopefully.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's go to the audience. I'm sure there'll be questions. I would just ask that you wait until you have a microphone in front of you, because those that are watching our live stream won't be able to hear you otherwise. So we'll start with a few questions in the front. So first with you, sir. If you can give your name and your affiliation.
My name is John Dale, and I'm a professor at George Mason University, and I've been a long-time observer of politics in Myanmar also. I've been very intrigued by this dynamic your analysis is set up between China's proposition and Myanmar's proposition for what to do with Rohingya. This emphasis on poverty that you say that China is focusing on as the root problem also would raise questions for me about the One Belt, One Road policy, especially as it's running through Rakhine state. And so that leads me to think that probably their position in the UN Security Council won't change much. But the citizenship question that you bring up through the national verification cards, that has a longer history to it that I think is important for people to understand too. Natalie Brenham has described this as a kind of bureaucratic cleansing process, where first they had the green cards, then the yellow cards, and then these new national verification cards that they wanted everyone to come in and replace with their previous cards. Each of those cards were giving them fewer and fewer rights. And so one reason many of the Rohingya who do not have those cards, as you point out, it's not just that they may have lost them, but they intentionally resisted getting them in the first place. There was active resistance inside. But it seems too that this all ties into Aung San Suu Kyi's difficult position you're describing. Ever since she took office, she has touted national reconciliation as a priority. That was her chief policy, and she's been consistent throughout. But if you have most of your voters, as you say, not recognizing the Rohingya as ethnic minorities, as citizens, sorry, in the first place, then to try and coax them in by giving them more than a national verification card and a real pathway to citizenship, you now have just made your national reconciliation problem even more difficult than it has already been. I'm wondering if you would agree with that as a piece of the difficult problem she's dealing with, and maybe speak a little bit to the One Belt, One Road piece on the other side of your analysis.
Okay, thanks. Let's take a question for you right here.
Thank you. My name is Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist. Before 2016, both the Bush and the Obama administrations focused attention on Burma in different ways. But, for a number of reasons. The problems in Burma, international, the Burma presented challenges internationally, both in terms of in Southeast Asia, federalism, which you mentioned, which is probably the biggest problem within the country, suppression of human rights, many or all of which continue to this day. My question, and I want to state this carefully, as appalling as the Rohingya situation is, that's the third way to pronounce it, Rohingya, as appalling as that situation is it serving to distract important attention from other reasons why Burma should be important to those of us in the West that continue? Sort of the way the Karens on the other side of the country sort of monopolized all the space 20 years ago, if you get my question.
Yes, thank you. Let's take one more question, then we'll come back to the panel. I think there was a question somewhere in the middle. Yes, you, sir.
Thanks. Addie Wilson, National Democratic Institute, and formerly the University of Notre Dame. Go Irish. I just wanted to ask, to what extent, if at all, are the Rohingya civil society being engaged either by the Chinese track, the Bangladesh track, or the Burmese track to resolving this?
That's some good food for thought. Either
Okay.
either of you should feel free.
Okay. Good to see you again, John. He's a faculty at George Mason University. He's been a long time observer and an expert in Burma studies, so it's good to see him again. One Belt, One Road. Of course, this is the larger, the broader picture, and underneath we have what we call China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, CMEC. And definitely, I think I would largely agree with you that I think I also said during my remarks that China's concern is mostly economy. And of course, stability is one other sector, issue, which is largely along what we call the Kachin and Karen and other, the northern part of the borders. But with respect to Rohingya, as you said, their projects are there exactly in the Rakhine area. Therefore, I think for them, what they need most is stability. No more fighting, and people go back, and they get people to do their job and extract the resources that they want. I think definitely, if you look at that way, I think you're absolutely right that China's focus is on economy, to strengthen the economic ties between Burma and China by saying that they would like to ensure that the Burmese government is not disappointed or let's say offended by what they do and what they say. That's why China is very careful on this issue. They would not say anything that would offend the Burmese authority on this Rohingya question. But if you look at deeper inside the story, it's not just the Rohingya issue, but it's tied down to their investments in the country. So something that might provoke them or that might offend Burma would affect their investment, economic opportunities in the country. If you, for example, if you look at the dam that was suspended, for example, China is very careful about their investment, and they would do anything to protect or promote their economic interests. I don't know if I answer your question. Okay.
Can I pitch in something
Sure,
here?
please.
One of the things with China is all political problems are about the economy. They say, well, we put money in Tibet, Tibetans will be happy. We put money in Xinjiang, they'll be happy. Hong Kong, they'll be happy. So there's a tendency of China to reduce these kinds of ethnic national problems to economic problems. And is that somewhat limited or too limited to actually help in solving the problem? Is it just an economic problem?
See, I think we all know that China is not a democratic country. It's a one-party state, and their foreign policy is largely dependent on what they see would benefit their interests rather than the other party, which means it always comes down to economy. But I don't want to say that, because what their position is non-interference on the internal affairs of member states, which is part of the, let's say, the Pokpo relationship. The Pokpo means the friendship, the fraternity relations between China and Burma has been there since late in 1940s, 50s. So they would like to maintain that relationship. The only time when we're a little bit skeptical or when we're a little bit, worried was when NLD came to power. We thought that NLD would move toward the West, because it was the China and others who put Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest and also these economic sanctions. But since the West is distancing from Burma and Aung San Suu Kyi especially for Rohingya and others, and I think China is filling the void. But this is never something new. It has been there during the military time And now it's the same thing going again, what we call conflicting international approaches, which means the West or democracies versus the non-democracy in the region, which is led by China. What we call, recent time they call it constructive engagement. And now, they would say that what we do is beneficial for the Rohingya community as well as the Burmese community, or the Burmese government, and for Bangladesh. Of course, both in Bangladesh and Burma, China invests heavily. So they would like to protect in both countries. So I think definitely every time we talk about China, because they are not a superpower yet, as we all know, they may like to project, but I think they are not there yet. Therefore, for them now is to strengthen their economy. And that's why they are coming up with this One Belt, One Road initiative, the BRI, then now CMEC, China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And of course, with the peace process, definitely, when we talk about the peace process, it's a little bit different than the Rohingya crisis, because for some of the ethnic armed groups that's fighting along that Kachin, Karen areas, especially the Kachin areas, some of them are ethnically Chinese, and they have the population on the other side of the border inside China. Therefore, for them is stability as well as what? Trying to support its own people. So I think we have to separate these two cases, because the Rohingya crisis is another one, and stability and what is that, the armed group. Of course, some of the armed groups, some people claim that they get direct support from some of the Chinese authorities, but I do not have any proven or record or let's say documentary proof that. But I think if you look at these people have, every time there is a problem between ethnic armed groups and the Burmese government, it is none other than China who tried to mediate the crisis. Come in, which means they have a political influence, economic influence, and I think they will continue to stay that way for the future, in the future as well, unfortunately or fortunately. I think I think I agree with your comment, and that many of the other issues, because last time before this Rohingya crisis started, we always talk about the fight between the Burmese military forces and either the Kachin or the Karen or the Shan or the Chin and others. But those things have been become a shadow now, or let's say because of the Rohingya crisis. I think. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. See, but let me tell you one thing. There are 3 stages of minorities' demand in Burma. Let me explain very quickly. The first one is ethnic groups that have their own states and demand for autonomy. The next group is ethnic groups that are citizens but which do not have their own separate state, like the Wa. They don't have their own state, but they want their own state. They have autonomy, they don't have their own state officially recognized by the government. The third group, the third level is ethnic groups which are not recognized by the state and would like to be recognized, such as Rohingya and others. So there are 3 levels. Definitely and ultimately, it is not just Rohingya crisis, but it's the entire what we call ethnic minorities. The question has to be resolved. Of course, this ongoing meeting has been. I have in the audience one of the elected member of parliament, Pulin Uk. He belongs to the Chin community. He is here with us. Thank you, Pulin Uk, for coming. See, they have been directly engaged in this peace negotiation process. And what happens is that I just published an article on the quest for federalism in Myanmar. Please, if you get a chance to read it. It was published by Taylor and Francis from London just last month. So I talk about the different types of federalism that we have in theory, or let's say in the West. And I try to see which one might fit in Burma. At the moment, we do not know what kind of political solution we will have. We will see. They talk about, the most widely talked about issue is federalism. but nobody knows exactly what kind of federalism that they would have. In fact, in 2014, when I was writing a book, I met the former Prime Minister General Kim Yoon, and I asked him, because he was the one who introduced the seven-step roadmap toward democracy. And I asked him, what kind of do you support federalism? He said yes. Before, army people would never say they support federalism. In fact, you would be put behind jail if you talk about federalism. But now they changed and they said, we support federalism, but we support a kind of federalism that suits the interests of the Burmese society. And sometimes I question whether that would be similar to Burmese way to socialism that we learn in the history, Burmese way to democracy, or Burmese way to federalism. So, but definitely other issues are also equally important. It's that the scale of violence and deportation was so huge that Rohingya crisis overshadowing other issues, but that doesn't mean that other issues have vanished or disappeared. Definitely it's there. The problem is there. They are important. Right. And finally, role of Rohingya civil society. Definitely, when I was invited by the University of Dhaka last year to give a lecture on Rohingya crisis, I saw somebody called, I forgot his name, but there is a guy, Burmese Rohingya organization or something. He's a president. He came from UK, and he was very vocal, outspoken on the Rohingya crisis. Definitely there are organizations working on behalf of this population. Even in the United States they have. There is a friend of mine who works in University of Pennsylvania. He's a senior professor who somehow belong to the Rohingya community. Wakal Udin, I think, John, if you may have heard him, I think he's been traveling across the country giving talks on the Rohingya with Journey and others. So there have been works, there have been advocacy programs here and there, but I think internationally, I think they are not very visible yet, I would say. Maybe, I may be wrong, but as far as my observation is concerned, but not inside Burma, definitely, not inside Burma. Because inside Burma, they are restricted. They have no freedom movement, and forget about citizenship or identity acknowledgement or recognition. So they are very confined to the area where they live. Therefore, the activities of civil society, Rohingya civil society in Burma is non-existent, I would say. But outside, definitely in overseas, including United States, we have some organizations working on behalf of them. Definitely in UK, they are advocating and trying to highlight the issues to the international community. But I think it's not because of what these civil societies are doing. I think it's more about what is really happening. The mass exodus of the community from one country to another, and the scale of violence and the killing that is attracting attention around the world, including the media. I think it's more about what's happening on the ground rather than the activities or the works of these what we call civil society organizations. Yep. Definitely they are, but but they are under tight control. What we have to remember there is that because they cannot do everything that they want to, because they are under the supervision of the local authorities from the Bangladesh government, and definitely the international committees such as the UNHCR are also taking their part. But of course they are. In fact, they have let's say separated in different regions or different groups, and they have their own leaders that are elected among themselves. There are definitely activities going on, but it is not really. They are limited because they do not have the enough resources that they could somehow. For example, they don't have proper schools. And I just read this morning in the news that Bangladesh schools are expelling Rohingya students. And for them, the Rohingya, imagine 1 million or so population living in a camp, and they don't have a proper education. Of course, they have some informal schools, but those are not recognized by the government. So they have limitations. Do I answer your question? Yeah. Thank you.
Let's take another round of questions. We'll start middle, two women in the middle. First, right here. Yeah, you. And then we'll go down here. Yes, you with the... red shirt, I think.
Yeah. My name's Anna Sophia. I'm an intern at Refugees International. So my question was, since Myanmar is clearly not ready to take returns, then and we're seeing that the Rohingya refugees will likely not be moved to Bashar Char, then what are some potential alternatives to moving them to the island that you see, since Cox's Bazar is so overcrowded?
If you could pass the mic 2 people down to your left. There we go. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Nadira Saraswati, and I'm currently an intern at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And so, one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, what's really missing from this conversation is the role of women. So, I was wondering if there is a move to create spaces for women to contribute to either the peace process or the crisis itself, and what would women's meaningful participation look like in the context of Myanmar? Thank you.
And then gentleman in the row, 1 row behind. Yes.
My name is Utsav, and my question is regarding ARSA. Do you see any role of any radical groups out of Pakistan or any radical groups out of Syria, the recently ending battles in Syria, taking part in ARSA? And where do you see ARSA going forward?
Okay. 3 good questions.
Yeah, excellent question.
Okay. All right. I don't know if I got it correctly, your questions. What are the other options other than moving them to the Bhasan Char or the floating island? This is a very difficult question. I don't know, Micah, you would like to respond, but let me try. And if I don't answer the way you would like to hear, please feel free to help me out here. I think I already said a few possibilities. One being going back, and which you said you are skeptical. Definitely, I'm also skeptical. They're not positive that they would be going back soon, anytime soon. And of course, the most likely thing that may happen is them, the status quo, means staying in Bangladesh. And it's overcrowded, we know, the Cox's Bazar, and that's the reason why they are trying to send people to floating island. I think I do not completely rule out that people would eventually move there. Let's say if they are going to provide maybe free schools, free meals, or maybe some incentives, some people may choose to move rather than being sent back to Burma forcibly. There's a possibility that could happen. That's one thing, but I don't know when. And the second possibility is that the international community accepting for resettlement, and which I also don't see likely to happen near future, but that's one other option, because many Rohingyas would like to be resettled. They don't want to stay permanently in a country like Bangladesh where they cannot go outside of the camp, or neither do they want to go to Burma where they would like to go through the same experience. Therefore, they would like to see a third country resettlement. But the question is, who would like to take that? So, do I answer your question? I think that's my response with me. Michael, you would like to say something?
Just a comment. The Vietnam years ago had a very similar problem and big detention centers. As someone who was a professor in the University of Hong Kong for decades, I lived right by the Whitehead Detention Center. And eventually, the pressure does build up, and people judge they just can't leave it as it is, that these people can't live indefinitely in a detention camp. And so how you can mobilize, you work for an organization probably that does this, mobilize some support abroad for relocation of some. And in the Vietnam case, then they allowed some to go back. There was a voluntary return and some coercive returns, actually. But perhaps that would make it easier to swallow for Myanmar if there was some greater international effort on the refugee front. Yeah.
Michael, you want to add something? No?
Did you want to respond to that?
Okay. All right. Coming to yours, the second question, the role of women. Are you talking about within the Rohingya community or the Burma as a whole? Okay. I think let me put it a little bit differently than yours. It's not that women in Burma do not have a role in politics. Definitely they do. You can see Aung San Suu Kyi is a woman. She is the de facto leader. Of course, she doesn't control everything. And also there are many women organizations, including Women League of Burma, which was in existence in exile for many, many years. And they, I think, in fact, they came here and received some awards from the U.S. I don't know, some organizations, even here in Washington, D.C. So even Kachins, Karens, and Chin, and other all minority groups, they have their own women wing, and they are actively working on it. Of course, it's not like we American society where women are visible in every sense, or let's say every aspect of, let's say, society. Maybe things are not yet, but I think definitely we cannot say that there is no role for women in Burma. Definitely there is, but maybe maybe they are not as vibrant as some other countries yet. And final one, radical group, either Pakistan or let's say Syria. I think so far, I mean, I already briefly mentioned the position of the Indian government, that they suspect and they say that they have an evidence to prove that Rohingya and these radical groups are having link. And that's the reason why they say they are a threat to India's national security. But they do not provide the details with the public. It's not publicly accessible. Therefore, I myself, as an academic researcher, I do not have those access to those information. I do not know, but I think even if they do, there's a possibility that they have. In fact, ISIS and others openly came out saying that we will fight on behalf of the Rohingya because they are our brothers. We have to fight against the Burmese government, the military, for killing our people. They openly said. You can watch in the YouTube. That's publicly available. But if you look at the type of weapons that they use to attack the security posts in Rakhine state, for example, swords and others, they are not sophisticated ones. They are just very traditional weapons. So I think even if there is maybe some moral support at level, I don't think there is a huge supply of arms coming from them and trying to train them. But we should never rule out that situation may happen if they continue to stay in a camp where, let's say, they don't have enough food, or where they don't have enough, let's say, opportunity to, let's say, for their survival, or even for their kids' future. I mean, if they've gone through a lot of frustration, I mean, for them, it might be just better to work with people who can provide them anything. So, I mean, there is possibility, but at the moment, I may be wrong, but I personally do not see that there is a strong evidence to suggest that they have link with these terrorist networks.
Yeah, and on that note, on the issue of radicalization, I do know that there's been suggestions in New Delhi that some of these Rohingya refugee camps in India or elsewhere could be fair game for the likes of Lashkar-e-Taiba to try to recruit. But again, it's unclear to me how accurate such assessments are. And I do know there was a report that was put out, I believe it was the Sufan Center, about Al-Qaeda and the South Asia affiliate of Al-Qaeda, AQIS. And it had several pages about how there have been efforts to try to recruit from the Rohingya community, from the Arakan army. So it's something to refer to. We have time for a few more questions. I haven't come to this side of the room that much, I don't think. So, yes. That's a great question. It'll be very tough to answer, but a good question. Any other questions from people that haven't asked a question yet? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Todd Buchwald here from the Wilson Center. I wanted to ask about two things, one that happened, one that didn't. The one that happened was the ICC prosecutor began an examination of the situation with Rohingya. And the one that didn't was the State Department studied and led up to, but never decided to call what was happening genocide. And my question for you is, what reaction or what impact, if any, did this have on the relevant actors, the security forces, the Rohingya community itself, or maybe the or outside actors?
Those are two good questions to wrap up.
Okay. I think the second question, Michael might be a better person because he belongs to the law department. So, but I'll try to answer the political angle, and then Michael will help me out the rest. Okay, first this is a very interesting question, but very difficult to answer. Do you see any solution? Of course, we would like to see a solution happening, and I already laid out a few possibilities, but that doesn't mean that those things will become a solution. But it is possible, and I don't know how many years it will take. Because this is not the first time. You have to remember that this Rohingya crisis started in the 1940s. And mass exodus happened in the 1970 during the Bangladesh War of 1972, around 1972. And this has been several waves. 2012 it started, in the 90s it happened, 2012, 2016, 17. So this has happened for quite some time now. And we may see a solution. I mean, definitely for every problem there is a solution at some point. The question is when. I mean, that's a good question, but unfortunately, even if I try to be smart here, I think I may be wrong. So it may take, let's say, maybe 10 to 20 years, hopefully. But the plan was to complete the repatriation in 2 years. When they reached an agreement in 2017, the plan was to repatriate all refugees to Burma within 2 years. But we don't see anything happening until now. So that's I think it would largely also depend on what the governments of both countries are doing. At the same time, ASEAN and some major powers such as China in the region, and of course the UN Security Council also has a lot to do here. Because it is the most powerful. I mean, there's no doubt that there is nothing more powerful than UN Security Council in the entire international security system. So, but there is China and Russia, which always stand on the side of Burma when it comes to these issues. And what impact the ICC investigation and of course the State Department, which eventually did not, of course, define or declare as a genocide. I think for this, as I just said in my response to him, ICC or any international institution per se are not really how do we say, not really effective until and unless there is an enforcement mechanism, such as the UN Security Council. Okay, for example, let's say they investigate, they find the Burmese leaders guilty of this. Who is going to take action? Is it China? Definitely China is not going to do it. Is it India? China, and then India would never do it because India has its own problems in the Northeast India, insurgency problem. And India has its own Act East policy, which tried to strengthen ties with Burma and the entire Southeast Asia, in fact, Asia Pacific. America would not come like what happened in Iraq. So eventually, I think this has maybe, of course, it's a leverage, or I would say this is a strong signal, a strong message to the international community. But the question is whether this would be implemented at all, even if there is a formal investigation and the conclusion is that Burmese government is guilty. I think that's why I said the voice or the position of the Security Council is very critical here. And of course the US government, and maybe they can somehow find a solution by working together with China and India, possibly, what the so-called safe zone proposed by Bangladesh. Even though this might be unlikely, but I think those kind of things that could somehow bring together different parties who are either supporting or opposing the whole idea of repatriation. If they somehow work together as have a coordinated approach on the issue, definitely, ICC and those investigations will have impact on the future of these people.
I have to say I'm a bit of a skeptic about the ICC. It seems often we have the impression that sort of the North is putting the South on trial, and I think that sometimes discredits what it does. We saw in the Philippines, as soon as they launch an investigation, then the Philippines pulls out. I would expect the same probably in South and Southeast Asia in general. So I'm not sure if there's a kind of this. I call it the white horse solution. To come galloping in on a white horse and solve problems. I rather agree with some of the earlier statement Nehginpao made that this is a multi-textured problem. So we can make some moves on refugee problem. We can make some moves on trying to mediate between groups. I would actually like to see India share its experience with federalism even. I think India may be one of the, it's so-called, there's some scholars have written recently, a couple years ago now, Juan Linz, Alstepan, and Yogendra Yadav wrote this book characterizing the kind of federalism in India as a state nation, kind of suggesting a more inclusive kind of federalism. And when I teach this to my Burmese students in Hong Kong, they're thrilled. They just see this as offering new ideas. So I think there's room for that, and there's room for new ideas as well. But whether the ICC is going to solve the problem, and I think the U.S. was kind of course, the U.S. is not a party to the ICC, and it was kind of reluctant to throw that spanner in the midst of all this problem. Whether wise or not, I don't know.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up. And, on the issue of solutions and what could be coming in the future, looking at this in the context of the international community's response, I think we sort of, and this gets to your question, we sort of live in a sort of, times are framed by a paradox that with social media and its ilk, the world knows about these humanitarian disasters much more quickly than had been the case previously. But at the same time, it's an era where governments simply are not as compelled to, they're not galvanized by humanitarian disasters as had been the case in a previous era. It's just a lot more complicated. And of course, the United States, the world's sole superpower at this moment in time at least, it's trying to recede from the world because of the Trump administration. So it's difficult. But at any rate, we do have to wrap up. This has been a really terrific discussion. So I thank Dr. Kipgen one more time, and also thank Michael Davis for his excellent comments as well. A round of applause for our panel. And thank you all for coming.